Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 18 stories for you, including the Ledger of the Drift, the Late Ticket, the Jointed Reach of the Silt-Walker, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The Ledger of the Drift. I have spent 40 years tending to the Silent Acre, ensuring that every soul finds its rightful place in the loam. Most plots are easy. They take a body and hold it steady. But Plot 109 is different. It refuses to be occupied by a permanent tenant, even though I have prepared the earth for him 3 times over. Today, the ledger marks a new entry, the boy of the trawler. He is currently adrift on a vessel with no engine, suspended in a salt-heavy void where the horizon has lost its meaning. He sits on the floorboards, his small hands gripping the edge of an empty rocking chair that shouldn't be there, for there was no room on the deck to haul it from the shore. He watches it with wide, unblinking eyes, watching how the wood sways without a breeze. To him, the chair is never truly empty, it is occupied by a shape. He calls her the fold. She does not have a face in the way we do, nor does she have skin to feel the spray of the salt. She is a woman-shaped gap in the air, a living puncture in the fabric of the world. When she moves, light doesn't just hit her, it bends around her like water flowing around a smooth stone. If you look at her from the front, she looks like a shimmering oval of distortion, similar to how heat ripples off a summer road, but with the distinct silhouette of a curved spine and 2 reaching arms. The boy sits in silence, his voice small against the rhythmic creak of the hull. She is drinking the light today, he whispers to me as I record his words into the ledger. He means that the blue of the afternoon is being pulled into her, stretched thin like taffy until it turns a deep, bruised violet where she stands. She doesn't walk so much as she slides through the space she occupies, leaving a trail of warped reality in her wake. When she passes near a crate of nets, the ropes seem to lean toward her, yearning to be touched by her curvature. As the sun begins to dip, the rocking chair starts to move faster. The boy leans forward, his chin resting on his knees. She is hungry for the edges, he says. He watches as a nearby pulley moves toward her, the metal arm curving into an impossible arc as it enters her personal space. She isn't just sitting in the chair, she is pulling the very essence of the ship into her orbit. The wood of the chair begins to groan, not from weight, but from the way she stretches the distance between the floor and the seat. Then, the distortion expands. The gap in the air begins to widen, the woman-shaped void stretching until it covers half the deck. The boy reaches out a hand, his tiny fingers trembling. He doesn't feel her skin, he feels the sensation of his hand disappearing into a pocket of elsewhere. When he touches her, his thumb seems to stretch into 3 different directions at once, the light around his knuckle bending until it looks like a prism. She wants to hold me, the boy says, though he is afraid to let go. The chair begins to spin, but not in a circle. It rotates on its own axis, twisting the air into a corkscrew shape. The sea outside becomes a blur of refracted colors as the fold expands her reach. She isn't just a gap anymore, she is a vacuum of presence. In the final moments before the ship settles into the deep swell, the boy let out a soft gasp. "She found my shadow," he whispered. He watched as his own silhouette was pulled off the floorboards and swallowed by her, becoming a permanent part of her warped interior. The chair stopped its frantic spinning and held perfectly still, though it now looked like it were made of melted wax. I closed the ledger and marked Plot 109 as occupied, but as I look at my own shadow on the grass of the Silent Acre, I realize that when she finally takes the boy's voice, she will need a new shape to fill her void. The boy is still there, sitting in his chair, but he no longer casts a shadow on the wood. He is becoming part of the bend. The Late Ticket. I am writing this because the silence of the theater feels heavier now that the lights are up. I wanted to describe it as a perfect haunting, but haunting implies a ghost that stays. This was different. It was an arrival. The auditorium was cavernous, smelling of buttered popcorn and old velvet. I was alone, or so I thought. Every seat was empty except for the very last row, where a small boy sat perfectly still. He wore a corduroy jacket that looked slightly too large for his frame. The film on screen was a silent masterpiece of flickering shadows, but as the credits began to roll, I realized the boy wasn't watching the screen. He was staring at the empty seat directly beside him. Every few seconds, he would lean toward the vacancy and whisper with a voice that sounded like crushed silk. "Sorry for being late," he murmured. It was strange because there was no one there to be late for. The vacant chair held nothing but the faint scent of ozone and a slight indentation in the cushion, as if someone had just vacated it. I tried to focus on my own breathing, but then I heard it, the sound of a draft. Even though every window in this massive theater was bolted shut, a thin ribbon of cold air began to snake through the rows. It didn't just move the dust, it pulled at the velvet of the chairs like invisible hands, making the fabric ripple in waves. The boy turned his head toward me. His hair was a wild thicket of copper curls, and his skin had the texture of polished river stone. He wasn't a pale phantom. He looked solid, yet his proportions were slightly off. His elbows were just a bit too sharp, and his knees bent in ways that suggested a hidden hinge. It was as if he were an object designed by someone who understood the concept of a human, but hadn't quite mastered the physics of one. The draft grew stronger. It started to hum, a low vibration that rattled my teeth and made the very floorboards beneath my feet tremble. It wasn't coming from the door or the rafters. It was emanating from the boy's shadow, which stretched out across the floor even though the overhead lights were dim. As the shadow lengthened, it began to detach from his feet, creeping toward me like spilled ink searching for a basin. The air grew thick with the taste of wet iron. The boy stood up. He didn't walk. He seemed to glide forward as if the air itself were carrying him, his corduroy jacket swaying without the help of momentum. He stopped 3 seats away from me and bowed slightly. "I am sorry for what happens next," he said, his voice trembling with a strange anticipation. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest like a deep-sea current, making it difficult to draw a full breath. Then, the sound began, a rhythmic tapping, like a fingernail striking wood, coming from the ceiling directly above my head. 1, 2, 3, then it stopped. I looked up and saw a tiny crack forming in the plaster, but nothing fell out. It was as if something had struck the roof of the world and decided to stay there. The boy took another step closer. His copper curls seemed to shimmer with a faint, metallic sheen under the dying light of the projector. He reached out a hand, not a long one, but a sturdy, wide palm, and pointed at my own shadow. "Don't be angry," he whispered. The draft suddenly whipped around the room, turning into a miniature cyclone of cold air that lifted the dust off the floor and swirled it into a halo around us. For a moment, we were suspended in a swirling vortex of gray particles. I felt the weight of his gaze. It wasn't just a boy. He was a witness. He seemed to be waiting for a climax that hadn't occurred in my timeline yet, a crescendo of emotion or action that he was observing with intense, quiet focus. The theater felt smaller now, the walls closing in until they were only inches from my shoulders, shrinking the vast space into an intimate, suffocating chamber. Then, with a sound like a heavy book slamming shut, the draft vanished. The temperature skyrocketed, and the silence became absolute. The boy blinked, his face relaxing into a look of immense relief. He looked at me one last time, his copper hair falling over his brow. "Thank you for watching," he said. Then he sat back down in his seat and disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a single, damp footprint on the velvet. I stayed there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the world to move again. When it finally did, I realized that while he was gone, his shadow remained etched onto the floor, permanently fixed in the shape of a boy reaching out to grab something that was no longer there. The jointed reach of the Silt-Walker. Redacted. Subject 402. Location: the lowland swamp. Time: post-departure. The last airboat departed at 1804. The fog was not merely a weather condition. It felt like a physical weight, a thick, damp woolen blanket draped over the boardwalk that swallowed the horizon until only 3 feet of timber remained visible. I stood alone on the planks, listening to the rhythmic drip of moisture falling from the cedar beams. The airboat had carried away the tourists, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy in my ears. I noticed the first freckle at 1812. It was small, a tiny speck of burnt umber suspended in the thickest part of the mist. It didn't move like dust. It drifted toward me with intent. Then came another, and another. They were drifting from the unseen depths of the fog, hundreds of them, tiny dots of color and texture that seemed to be migrating toward my face. Redacted, I realized they weren't just drifting. They were coalescing. As they gathered in front of my nose, they began to form a geometry. They weren't random marks anymore. They were arranging themselves into the distinct, rugged texture of an unfamiliar face. It wasn't a solid mask, but a constellation of dots forming a brow, a bridge of a nose, and a wide, slightly lopsided mouth that hadn't yet found its teeth. That was when I heard the sound, a wet, rhythmic clicking, like wood snapping underwater. From behind a cluster of weeping willows at the edge of the boardwalk, something emerged. It did not walk, it reached. A single arm extended from the gloom. It was massive and textured like weathered oak, but as it moved toward me, it performed an impossible feat of geometry. With every inch it gained towards my chest, a new elbow sprouted. First, there was the primary joint near its shoulder. Then, a secondary knob pushed out from the middle. By the time the arm reached my waist, 3 more elbows had burst forth in a row, each one slightly smaller than the last. The arm didn't just bend, it unfolded like an accordion of bone and bark. It possessed a strange, iridescent sheen, shifting from copper to mossy green as it moved through the light. Redacted, I tried to step back, but my boots felt rooted to the planks. "Who goes there?" I whispered. My voice felt flat in the damp air. The arm didn't respond with a sound, but it continued its progression. It moved with a jerky, stuttering motion, asterisk click thud star. New joints erupted from the surface of the limb like bubbles rising through syrup. Each new elbow provided a fresh point of pivot, allowing the arm to spiral around my torso like a vine seeking a trellis. The face formed by the freckles grew clearer as the arm drew closer. The dots were now so dense they looked like velvet. I could see the curve of a cheekbone and a pair of heavy lids that weren't closed yet. It was an expression of profound, weary recognition. Redacted, it reached for my head. The arm began to divide again. From the wrist of the reaching limb, dozens of tiny elbows sprouted in rapid succession, creating a frantic web of joints that fanned out like the petals of a blooming flower. The texture of the arm changed from bark-like to something smoother, resembling polished river stones. It was no longer just an arm, it was a sprawling lattice of reaching potential. It didn't grab me with a palm. Instead, the many elbows tilted inward, cradling my head in a nest of articulated joints. The freckled face moved closer until it was inches from mine. I could see the individual dots now. Some were deep indigo, some were ochre, and they seemed to pulse with a faint internal light. "Is it you?" I asked, my breath hitching in my throat. The freckles shifted. The face didn't smile, but the dots rearranged themselves into a look of sudden, sharp realization. Redacted, then, the final elbow appeared, a tiny, perfect joint at the very tip of the reach. It folded inward, tucking itself against my forehead like a secret held in place. I felt a slight pressure as the entity finally closed the gap. The face made of freckles settled into a permanent state of awe, and for a moment, the fog seemed to hold its breath. Then I felt it, a cold, dry sensation against my temple. It wasn't just looking at me anymore. It was trying to remember what it felt like to have skin instead of dots. I realized then that the entity wasn't just reaching for me from the swamp. It was reaching for the space I occupied in its own memory. As the last of the freckles settled, a new set of dots began to drift away from its face and onto my own skin, replacing my features with its peculiar, dotted geography. I looked down at my hands and saw that my fingerprints were vanishing, replaced by the same burnt umber speckles that had formed the stranger's eyes. Redacted, I am no longer the observer. I am becoming the texture of its dream. The blink of the Behemoth. Logbook A, Day 1. The vessel feels stable today. We have entered the Great Stillness, a region of the ocean where the water is no longer blue, but a bruised shade of violet. There is little wind, and the hum of the engines provides a rhythmic pulse that keeps us from drifting into total apathy. I find myself staring at the shoreline or what passes for it. It is not land, but a shelf of calcified sediment that seems to curve upward like a frozen wave. Logbook B, Day 14. The silence is different now. It isn't just the absence of sound, it is the presence of something waiting. We passed a structure today, drifting through a fog so thick we could barely see our own bow. In the center of that mist sat a highway rest stop, isolated and defying logic in the middle of the deep sea. A single vending machine stood there, its light flickering in a frantic, irregular heartbeat. It didn't belong to a road, yet it felt like the most grounded thing in existence. Logbook A, Day 22. I have begun to feel small. Not just physically small, but conceptually diminished. It is as if we are no longer a ship sailing across an ocean, but a single spark of thought moving through a vast, dreaming mind. Every time the hull creaks, it feels like a nerve firing in a giant brain. The water isn't just liquid anymore. It feels like a thick, viscous fluid of memory. Logbook B, Day 28. We have anchored near the rest stop. The vending machine is buzzing with a low, vibrating frequency that makes the crew's teeth ache. When we stepped onto the asphalt, which felt strangely warm and soft, like velvet skin, we saw it for the first time. It was lurking just behind the machine. A low, four-legged creature, immense in scale, but huddled close to the ground. Its body wasn't covered in fur or scales. Instead, its entire torso was composed of thousands of tiny, fluttering eyelids. They were all closed, layered over one another like shingles on a roof. Logbook A, Day 35. The entity is waking up. I can feel it in the way the ship sways. It isn't just moving through the water is reacting to its presence. We are currently inside the middle of its subconscious. When we look at the creature, it feels like looking at a mountain that is trying to decide whether to dream or to breathe. Logbook B, Day 40. The eyelids began to move today. It started with a single twitch near its hump, then spread like a ripple across a pond. Each tiny lid fluttered independently. They don't just open and close, they pulse in sequences, creating a shimmering texture of motion. It makes no sound when it moves, but the air feels heavier as each eyelid lifts to taste the atmosphere. We stood by the vending machine, and for a moment, the creature pressed its head against ours. Its skin felt like damp suede. Logbook A, Day 48. The realization has hit us. We are not observers of this beast, we are part of it. Each crew member is a distinct sensation, a flicker of hunger, a spark of fear, a momentary taste of salt. We are the thoughts it is currently processing. The ship is a single neuron traveling along its spine. Logbook B, Day 52. The creature has opened every lid simultaneously. It was a deafening experience for the senses, even though there were no literal sounds. For 3 seconds, thousands of tiny pupils stared at us from every inch of its body. In that moment, we weren't just standing on an asphalt road. We were being perceived by a consciousness so massive it could encompass the entire world. The vending machine flickered one last time and died, as if the thought had finished. Logbook A, Day 60. It is falling into a deeper sleep now. The vessel has settled into a groove in its side. We are drifting toward the tail, where the memories of the beginning start to fade. Logbook B, Day 65. We have stepped back onto the ship, but the rest stop is gone. The creature has shifted its weight, and we are moving with it. As I write this, the hundreds of eyelids on its flank are closing one by one, in a slow, deliberate order. It is settling into the deep dream. Again. Logbook A, Day 70. We are almost at the end of this cycle. The ship feels like a tiny speck of dust in a cathedral. Logbook B, Day 72. The creature has fully exhaled its breath of consciousness. We can feel it sinking back into the violet depths. It is no longer looking at us. We are simply part of the fact that it exists. But as I watch the last few eyelids on its neck settle into place, I realize something terrifying. The machine wasn't just a landmark. It was a souvenir from its previous dream, and now that it has woken up halfway, the road is beginning to dissolve into the meat of its waking mind. We are moving toward the mouth, and we can feel it preparing to swallow us. The Canyon of the Unfinished Lock. Sit down, Leo. Hold my hand and listen closely. Because there are things in this world that only exist when you aren't looking directly at them. My father told me his own story when he was a boy, and now I am telling it to you so you never have to fear the silence of the factory alone. It started with the Great Loom Works, a massive, skeletal factory where the machines had long since surrendered to rust. There were no workers left, only the humming of the pipes and the heavy smell of oil and old iron. My father was the night watchman there. His job was simple: walk the perimeter, check the pressure gauges, and ensure the ghosts of industry didn't claim any territory. But one Tuesday, during a shift where the moon was nothing but a thin silver sliver, he discovered the canyon. It wasn't a geological canyon made of stone. It appeared in the center of the assembly floor as if it had been carved out by an invisible blade. It was a deep, jagged rift in the floor and the air that stretched out for what felt like miles. But here is the strange part, Leo. When your father shouted into the canyon to test its depth, he heard his voice come back instantly, but there was no far wall to bounce off of. It was a canyon with no end, yet the echo returned perfectly. The further he walked toward it, the more the machines seemed to lean inward, as if they were straining to see what lay at the bottom of the rift. On the third night of his watch, the sound changed. It wasn't just an echo anymore, it was a rhythm. Jingle clink, it was a soft, metallic melody, like a handful of coins being tossed onto a velvet cloth. Then he saw it. Emerging from the rift was the key bearer. It didn't have skin or fur. Its body was a cluster of hundreds of mismatched house keys, fused together into a humanoid shape. There were heavy brass skeleton keys for oak doors, tiny silver ones for jewelry boxes, and jagged iron bits for gates. They weren't just attached to a frame, they were the frame itself. The key bearer moved with a peculiar, clicking gait, each step causing its body to chime softly. It had no face in the traditional sense, but where a head should be, there was a large, ornate Victorian key that swung like a pendulum. The key bearer didn't walk. It drifted toward the nearest solid object, seeking a home. That night, it found my father's lantern. It hovered over the glass casing, its body vibrating with a low hum. The keys shifted and rearranged themselves, searching for a friction that wasn't there. My father realized then why the echo was so perfect. The canyon wasn't just a hole in the floor, it was the key bearer's memory of every door ever locked, waiting to be opened. As my father stood frozen, the creature began to move faster. It didn't just jingle, it began to sing in a series of sharp, metallic pings. The canyon seemed to deepen, and the echo grew louder, repeating my father's own heartbeat back to him. Thump thump, thump thump. The key bearer spun around, its pendulum head swinging wide. It reached out with a hand made of tiny, rusted keys and touched the very air in front of my father's face. For a moment, the entire factory fell into a vacuum of absolute silence. Then, the jingle stopped. The creature didn't just stand there. It leaned forward, its hundreds of teeth-like keys clicking together as if it were smiling. It was looking for the ultimate lock, the one that didn't exist yet. My father realized then that the key bearer wasn't a visitor, it was a hunter. It traveled from canyon to canyon, searching for a door wide enough to let it in. When my father finally turned to run back toward the safety of the main gate, he felt a cold prickle on his neck. He looked back one last time. The key bearer was no longer in the canyon. It had moved to the floor right behind him, its body vibrating with anticipation. My father whispered the rule that he now teaches you. Never let the jingle stop, for once it finds your lock, it will never let you go. He reached out and touched the door handle of the heavy iron gate, feeling the key bearer's shadow fall over his shoulder. He turned the handle, the metal groaning in protest. The creature followed him, its body tilting toward the wood. It didn't need a key to enter. It simply pressed its head against the door and waited for the invitation. My father pushed the gate open and stepped through into the light of the morning, but as he did, he felt the tiny keys brush against his ear. He looked down at his own feet and saw that where the key bearer had stood, a new set of keys had appeared on the floor, perfectly sized to fit the door he had just opened. The entity didn't disappear into the shadows. It stayed right there, waiting for him to turn around. He realized then that while he was outside, the creature was still inside, and it had finally found its favorite lock, the one he had just left behind. the echo of the deep. Sit down, Leo. Stay very still and look at the screen because if you want to survive the silence, you have to understand how it works. Your grandfather told me this when I was your age, and now I am telling you before we go into the Great Hall tonight. The room is never truly empty, he whispered. It is simply waiting for something to happen so it can copy it. We are standing in the center of the aquarium now, just as the last of the tourists have filed out and the lights have dimmed to a soft, underwater blue. The water is heavy with the scent of salt and ozone. It feels peaceful, but you must remember the rule. If you see something on your screen that hasn't happened in the room yet, do not blink until it does. Look at my phone, Leo. I'm starting the video call now, even though there is no one else here to answer it. The camera captures our faces, and behind us, the towering glass walls of the jellyfish tank glow like a pulsing neon heart. At first, nothing happens. Then, look closely at the corner of the screen where the shadows gather near the floor. A soft thud occurs on the screen, a heavy, muffled sound of something hitting wood. But wait for it. 1 second passes in total silence, and then, right here in the real world, a heavy wooden crate tips over in the far corner with a matching thud. That is its trick. The thing is lagging behind reality by exactly 1 heartbeat. It watches what we do, digests our movements, and then plays them back like a ghost trying to catch up. Now, watch the water. A small ripple appears on the screen in the center of the main tank, spreading outward in a perfect circle. We are standing perfectly still, yet the screen shows the surface dancing. 3 seconds later, a giant koi fish leaps out of the water and splashes down exactly where the ripple started. It is mimicking our timeline, but it is slightly imperfect, like an actor rehearsing a script just a moment before the audience sees it. Do you see the way the light reflects? On the screen, a beam of blue light suddenly darts across the ceiling from left to right. In reality, nothing moved. Then, a second later, a stray spotlight flickers and sweeps across the room in that same arc. It is getting faster now. The entity is trying to catch up with our presence. On the phone, we see a faint movement near your feet, a tiny shadow of something small and fuzzy. Then, a moment later, a small sea anemone curls its tentacles toward your shoe. Is it close, you ask? It hasn't spoken yet in the room, but on the screen, we see its mouth move as if it were saying our names. A second later, your own voice echoes through the hall, though I didn't speak. Is it close? The sound is perfect, but it feels slightly hollow, like a recording played in a cavern. Now, look at the very top of the screen. You see a flicker of something huge moving behind the glass tank. It looks like a shimmering veil of silk waving in a breeze. Then, a massive wave of water surges forward, pushing against the glass with a heavy groan. The entity is no longer just mimicking our movements, it is mimicking the environment's soul. But here is the scary part, Leo. Look at the screen right now. There is a shape standing directly behind you in the video call. It has a body made of woven seafoam and textures of crushed velvet, with 3 distinct humps along its back like a camel. It doesn't have a face we can see clearly, but it has a crown of glowing pearls instead of hair. In the room, there is nothing behind you yet. Just empty space. The thing on the screen is preparing to manifest. It is loading itself into our reality. Don't blink, I tell you. On the screen, the velvet creature raises a limb made of braided kelp and reaches toward your shoulder. 1 second passes. Then, the air behind you grows cold, and the weight of a heavy, wet arm settles onto your back, pressing against your spine. You can feel its texture, cool, slightly damp, and smelling of ancient deep-sea trenches. We turn around together to face it. It is no longer just on the screen, it is standing in the room, vibrating with a low hum. It has 3 humps, a crown of pearls, and skin that looks like woven foam. It watches us with a face that seems to be made of polished river stones. It opens its mouth to make a sound, a long, low whistle that sounds like a flute played underwater. On the screen, it is still waiting for the real room to catch up. Then, the sound finally rings out, filling the hall with a melody that feels both old and new. The entity settles into the floor, its velvet body settling like a heavy rug. It has finished its mimicry of our moment. It stands there now, perfectly still, waiting for us to move so it can copy us again. We stay frozen, because we know that if we move, it will follow, forever trailing just 1 second behind our lives. The margin of the taken. I found the book in a dusty corner of a thrift store, tucked between two oversized encyclopedias. It was an old, leather-bound volume of poetry, but it wasn't the verses that caught my attention. It was the frantic handwriting scribbled into the margins. The previous owner had treated the edges of the pages like a diary, documenting a life lived in a house that didn't technically exist yet. I bought it on a whim, and for weeks I sat in my apartment tracing the ink. By the time I reached the final page, the notes changed from simple observations to a desperate warning about the model house, a specific development on the edge of town where every unit was perfect, identical, and perpetually empty. I decided to visit it on a Tuesday evening. The development felt eerie in its perfection. Each home was fully furnished, with velvet chairs, mahogany tables, and rugs that looked as though they had never been walked upon. I chose the third house on the left. It smelled of beeswax and fresh linen. As I stepped into the living room, the silence was heavy, almost tactile. I began to read the margin notes aloud as I walked through the rooms. "The kitchen is warm," one note said. "The bedroom holds a breath." The more I read, the more the house seemed to respond. Every time I turned a page, a faint hum vibrated in my molars. Then I saw it. Hanging in the air above the dining table was a sliver of light, a crescent moon that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't reflecting off a window or hanging from a chandelier. It simply floated, glowing with a pale, pearlescent hue. The notes described this as the indicator. According to the previous owner, when the moon appears in an empty room, it means the inhabitant is about to be harvested. I froze, my thumb marking the page of the poem. I felt a sudden shift in the air pressure. A faint static began to crackle, like the sound of silk rubbing against dry grass. It started at my feet and climbed upward. Then came the sensation, a prickling electricity that traveled up my forearms. My hair didn't just stand on end, it reacted to an invisible force. On my left arm, the hair flattened and splayed outward in a perfect, five-pointed pattern. It looked as though an unseen hand had pressed its palm against my skin from the inside out. I spun around toward the source of the static. There was nothing there but the heavy velvet curtains, yet they were swaying as if caught in a localized breeze. The moon moved closer, drifting toward me like a slow-motion bubble. With every inch it traveled, the static grew louder. It started to smell of ozone and old parchment. I felt my pulse quicken as the hair on my right arm began to mimic the pattern, mirroring the palm print of an invisible grip. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my voice sounding small in the cavernous room. No answer came, but the static surged. The floorboards beneath me groaned, not from weight, but from tension. The moon was now just inches from my face, casting a strange, blue-white glow over my features. It didn't flicker, it pulsed like a beating heart. I realized then that the house wasn't empty. It was waiting for its next permanent resident. The hair on my arms began to vibrate so intensely that they hummed a low morning note. The static charge became heavy, almost thick enough to touch. It felt as though the air itself was trying to wrap around me like a blanket of tiny sparks. I reached out a hand to touch the moon, but before my fingers could make contact, the static peaked into a deafening crackle. Suddenly, the sensation of pressure intensified. It wasn't just on my arms anymore. The hair on my scalp began to fan out, and the hair on my legs flattened against my shins. I felt a phantom weight press down on my shoulders, the unmistakable sensation of a massive, invisible palm descending from the ceiling. I closed my eyes, expecting a physical touch, but instead, I felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath that didn't belong to me. It was as if the house had inhaled me. The static settled into a steady thrum, and the moon flared one last time before vanishing into a single point of white light. I stood in the center of the room, perfectly still. The pressure on my arms remained, even though the invisible hand had moved. My hair stayed pinned in those distinct palm prints, marking me as something that had been touched. I took a step back toward the door, feeling the weight of the house's gaze. I reached for the doorknob, but before my hand could grasp it, the static gave one final, tiny pop. The room fell into a silence so profound it felt heavy. I looked down at my arms, where the hair still held the shape of that perfect, unseen grip. I realized then that the moon hadn't just indicated the moment of being taken, it had marked me as the one who would stay. As I turned to leave, I noticed a new line of ink had appeared on the very last page of the book in my hands, written in a hand that was still wet with fresh ink. The visitor has accepted the wait. The Echo in the Aisle. I took the job as a late-night inventory clerk for Vanguard's, a massive, dine department store that had been shuttered for a decade. The plan was simple: walk the labyrinth of aisles, count the remaining fixtures, and mark them for the demolition crew. It was supposed to be a solitary, rhythmic task. However, by my third night, I realized the store wasn't entirely empty. It started with a single sound, a heavy, deliberate footfall that echoed from the far end of the home goods section. I stopped moving. The sound stopped instantly. I took a step forward. A second later, a matching thud vibrated through the floorboards behind my heels. It wasn't an echo fades. This was a fresh strike against the dusty wood. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, but the timing was too precise. Every time I paused to count a stack of ceramic bowls or a row of copper pots, that silent companion would freeze behind me. By the second week, the sensation shifted from hearing to feeling. It felt like a weight in the air, a subtle pressure against my shoulder blades. Whenever I turned around quickly to catch the source, there was nothing but shadows and dust motes dancing in my flashlight beam. Yet, when I looked away, it was there. I began to notice it, or rather, the part of it that lived in the middle distance. It wasn't a ghost with a face or a body I could easily grasp. It was a hole in the architecture of the room, a shimmering distortion about 12 feet away from me at all times. It looked like a tear in a piece of velvet fabric, but instead of showing what was underneath, it showed a different kind of depth. It was a jagged oval of shifting textures, resembling wet moss mixed with hammered bronze. It didn't move toward me. It stayed perfectly suspended in the middle distance, maintaining its own orbit around my position. One Tuesday, the silence became heavy enough to ache. I was standing in the center of the clothing department, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The hole was there, hovering between the mannequins. It didn't have a mouth or eyes, but it seemed to pulse with a soft, rhythmic hum, like a bee trapped in a jar. I whispered to myself, "Are you following me?" The footsteps responded immediately. Thump, the hole jerked slightly, its bronze moss surface rippling like water disturbed by a pebble. It stayed exactly 12 feet away. I began to walk faster, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hole maintained its distance perfectly, drifting through the air with a fluid, boneless grace. It didn't have to turn. It simply existed in that sweet spot of space where the air felt thickest. Then came the night of the final inventory. A heavy fog had rolled into the store from the loading docks, muffling the sounds of the outside world. I was exhausted, my legs heavy from hours of walking the perimeter. I reached the grand atrium, a vast space where the ceiling had partially collapsed, letting in a sliver of moonlight. I stopped in the center. The hole was there, shimmering in the middle distance. For the first time, it didn't just stay still. It expanded. The edges of the tier began to fray, and the bronze moss texture started to bleed outward, stretching toward me like taffy. I felt a sudden, sharp coldness on my skin, even though nothing was touching me. I took a deep breath and shouted, "Who is there?" The hole reacted violently. It didn't just pulse, it inhaled. The surrounding air rushed toward the center of the distortion, pulling the dust and the scent of old fabric into its core. For a heartbeat, I saw something inside the hole, a glimpse of a vast, subterranean forest where the trees were made of glass. Then, the footsteps started again. But they weren't behind me anymore. They were coming from inside the hole. They were fast now, rapid-fire taps that sounded like wooden beads hitting a drum. The distance between me and the hole began to shrink. It was no longer 12 feet away. It was 10, then 8, then 5. Each foot it gained toward me made the hum grow louder, transitioning into a low, vibrating moan that I felt in my teeth. I tried to run backward, but the floor seemed to tilt as if the hole were exerting its own gravity. The bronze moss surface began to swirl, forming a whirlpool of texture. I could see the edges of it licking at the air like the tongue of a giant, invisible beast. It was closing in, devouring the space between us. Just as the edge of the hole touched my outstretched fingertips, the footsteps stopped one final time. The hum died into a piercing silence. The distortion expanded until it swallowed my hand, then my arm, then my chest. It didn't feel like being hit by an object. It felt like being pulled into a wide, cool throat. I stood frozen as the hole reached out and claimed me, its texture smooth against my skin. I realized then that it wasn't following me to see me. It was waiting for me to be ready to be consumed. Now, when I think of that night, I don't think of the store or the items I counted. I think of the way the hole stayed just far enough away for so long, making me feel safe, only to reveal that its patience was merely a prelude to its hunger. The patient in chair 14. Officer, I know how it sounds. If you tell me to stop trying to explain the logic of it, I'll listen, but please just hear the sequence of events first. It started on a Tuesday. I had a persistent ache in my lower back, the kind that makes your spine feel like a rusted hinge, so I booked an appointment at St. Jude's Clinic. The waiting room was large, filled with the hum of a failing fluorescent light and the scent of industrial lemon floor wax. There were 12 chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a heavy oak door. I sat in chair 14, right in the middle of the row. The nurse checked me in. My name, Arthur Pym, was written on a small slip of paper, and then she stepped into the exam room. That was when the clock started. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The people around me shifted. Some sighed. Others tapped their feet against the linoleum. I looked at my own reflection in the glass pane of the door leading to the hallway. At first, it was just a normal reflection, a man with messy hair and a tired expression. But as the minutes ticked by, I noticed something peculiar about my double. It wasn't moving perfectly in sync with me. When I took a breath, it waited a fraction of a second before expanding its chest. When I blinked, it kept its eyes open just a heartbeat longer than mine. By the 20-minute mark, the room grew unnaturally quiet. The other patients seemed to have drifted into a trance, their eyes glazed over as if they were listening to a distant melody. I looked back at my reflection in the glass. It had changed. It was no longer just a copy. It was a version of me that felt hungry. My reflection stood an inch taller than I did, its shoulders pulled back with a regal posture that I didn't possess. While my own face was weary, its face wore a wide, toothy grin that stretched across its cheeks until the corners reached almost to its ears. It didn't just mirror my movements anymore, it anticipated them. When I shifted my weight to the left, it had already begun to lean in that direction, swaying with an eagerness that felt predatory. It looked like a performer waiting for a cue, watching me with wide, amber-colored pupils that seemed to pulse with internal light. I tried to stand up to check if the doctor was coming, but as my hand touched the armrest of chair 14, I froze. My reflection didn't just sit there, it pressed its palm against the inside of the glass, matching my grip perfectly. It leaned forward so far that its forehead nearly touched the surface. Its hair, which usually flopped over my brow, was swept back as if by a gentle wind. "Are you ready?" It seemed to project, though its lips barely moved. I didn't speak aloud, but in my mind, the question echoed. I felt a strange pressure in the air, like the room was being squeezed by an invisible hand. The other patients were still motionless, but their reflections in the glass were doing something even stranger. They were weeping, laughing, and screaming in silence, while the physical people remained perfectly still. I realized then that I wasn't just watching a reflection, I was being observed by a resident of the glass. It began to move independently now. While I sat slumped back, it stood up inside the pane, its body unfolding like a piece of origami. It didn't have my slight slouch, it stood perfectly straight, its chin lifted high. Its skin looked smoother than mine, glowing with a faint pearlescent sheen under the flickering light. It reached out one hand and pressed it against the glass, and for a moment, I felt a corresponding warmth on my own palm. It wasn't cold like glass, it felt like velvet. The entity began to move its head in a slow, rhythmic circle. Every time it turned, its amber eyes locked onto mine with such intensity that I felt a physical tug on my soul, as if it were trying to pull me through the surface into its own dimension. Time became fluid. Was it an hour? Was it 3? The fluorescent light finally buzzed and died, plunging the room into a thick, heavy shadow. But my Reflection didn't disappear. It glowed with a soft, internal luminescence. It stepped toward the center of the glass, its body becoming slightly blurry at the edges, as if it were vibrating. It reached out both hands now, fingers spreading wide, not spindly or thin, but thick and rounded like river stones. It beckoned to me. I felt my own body begin to feel heavy, almost liquid, as if gravity were pulling my bones toward the floor. The reflection took a step forward, its foot pressing against the glass so firmly that it left a faint smudge of light. Then, the door finally swung open. A nurse stepped out, her face bright with a smile. "Arthur Pym," she called out. Her voice cracked the spell like a hammer hitting a crystal vase. I gasped and sat upright. The reflection instantly snapped back into its original position, matching my height, my messy hair, and my weary expression. It was just a mirror image again, perfectly still. But as the nurse walked toward me to lead me to the exam room, I caught one final glimpse of it in the glass. It wasn't smiling anymore. It was leaning forward with an intense, hungry eagerness, its mouth slightly agape, waiting for the moment I finally stepped through and swapped places with it. The rhythm of the vacant terminal. The shuttle bus hummed with a mechanical drone, its tires singing against the linoleum floors of Terminal 4. It was 3 in the morning, and I was the only passenger besides Leo, my 7-year-old son. We were caught in that strange, liminal pocket of airport life, where everything is prepared for thousands, but currently holds none. The shuttle looped continuously, passing empty gates and rows of unoccupied chairs. I looked at Leo. He was sitting perfectly still in his booster seat, his chin resting on his chest. He wasn't looking at the windows. Instead, he was staring intently at the overhead luggage compartment above us, which remained stubbornly shut. "Is it still sleeping?" he whispered, his voice barely cutting through the hum of the engine. I glanced up. There was nothing there but the metal latches and a thin layer of dust. "It is," I replied, trying to sound certain. "But it's getting closer." The shuttle lurched as it rounded a curve, and that was when the tapping started. It wasn't the erratic click of a loose piece of trim. It was deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. It sounded like someone striking a hollow wood block with a soft mallet. It came from inside the closet, the small, narrow storage nook at the very back of the shuttle where we kept our extra coats. "It's waking up," Leo said. His eyes widened. I felt a prickle of unease on my neck. In an airport this size, you expect noise, but not a rhythmic heartbeat of sound from a stationary box. The tapping grew louder, faster. It began to resonate through the floorboards. I reached back and gripped the handle of the closet door. "Do you want me to open it?" I asked. Leo shook his head vigorously. "Not yet," he whispered. "It's still blinking." I frowned. How could something in a closet blink without being seen? I felt as though if I opened that door, the silence of the shuttle would be permanently broken. The bus entered the long stretch between terminals A and B, a cavernous hall with high rafters and dim lights. Every few seconds, a new sound joined the tapping, a wet, rhythmic dripping. Drip, plip, drop. It wasn't the sound of water hitting a puddle. It sounded like heavy syrup falling onto velvet. I peered into the crack of the closet door. There was no ceiling inside that tiny space, just an infinite, murky void that seemed to swallow the light. From that void, something moved. It wasn't a face or a hand. It was a texture, a mass of iridescent, weeping scales that shimmered like oil on water. These scales weren't solid. They were porous, and as they moved, they secreted a thick, translucent nectar that pooled at the bottom. The entity didn't have limbs in the traditional sense. It looked like a cluster of floating, undulating spheres, each one covered in those dripping scales, orbiting a central core of soft, pulsing light. "It's looking at us now," Leo murmured. I saw a sphere rotate toward the door. It had no eyes, but it possessed a series of vibrating ridges that hummed when they caught our gaze. The tapping changed again. Now it was frantic, a staccato burst of hits against the interior walls of the closet. The dripping accelerated until it sounded like a steady downpour in a small room. I couldn't help it anymore. I pulled the door wide. A wave of cool, floral-scented air rushed out, carrying with it a faint mist. The entity didn't jump out. It simply expanded. It filled the closet and then spilled over the threshold, hovering just inches from my face. It was a magnificent, weeping thing, a cluster of spheres that moved like a school of fish in slow motion. It pulsed with a soft amber glow, and as it moved, it left trails of shimmering nectar on the seats. The tapping stopped instantly. The shuttle fell into a profound silence, the engine's hum suddenly feeling like an intrusion. The entity hovered there for a moment, its scales rippling in a wave of motion from front to back. It seemed to be tasting the air with those vibrating ridges. Then it did something unexpected. One of the larger spheres drifted toward Leo and bumped gently against his forehead. He didn't flinch. He smiled. "It says thank you," he said clearly. The entity then retracted, its spheres shrinking until it was a small, glowing orb nestled in the corner of the closet, still dripping its sweet nectar onto the floor. I breathed out, my heart rate slowing down. The shuttle continued its loop, the lights of the terminal blurring into long streaks of white and gold. We were moving toward Gate 12 now, the final stop before our flight. Leo leaned back in his seat, content. The entity remained in its nook, a quiet companion in the empty bus. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, the tension of the journey melting away into the rhythm of the wheels. I looked at my son, who was already beginning to drift off to sleep. "Is it going to stay with us?" I asked softly. Leo opened one eye and pointed toward the back of the bus where the closet Saturday. "It's not staying," he whispered. "It's just waiting for the next person to open the door." As the shuttle finally slowed to a halt at the gate, the entity gave one final, rhythmic tap against the wood. Then I noticed something that made my breath hitch. In the tiny pool of nectar it had left on the floor, there was a perfect, miniature reflection of the entire shuttle bus, but in the reflection, there were dozens of passengers sitting in every single seat, all staring at me with wide, unblinking mouths. The lag of the neighbors. I moved into Lot 42 because it was cheap, but also because the housing tract felt like a promise of normalcy. It was just raw earth and a freshly poured concrete foundation at the edge of the development, smelling of damp minerals and new possibilities. I spent my first week alone on that slab, watching the way the shadows stretched across the wet surface. Then came the neighbors from Lot 43, a couple who seemed perfectly ordinary, save for the way they greeted me. The first time we met over the fence, Mr. Henderson waved and said, "Lovely evening for a walk." His face was neutral when he spoke, but then his mouth curved into a wide, beaming grin that lingered for 3 seconds after he stopped talking. It wasn't a natural reaction. It felt as though his facial muscles were waiting for a cue to catch up with his voice. I started noticing it more each day. Whenever someone from the tract waved at me or spoke, there was a perceptible delay. They would finish their sentence in a state of slight confusion, and then half a second later, their faces would snap into expressions of pure joy. It was as if their smiles were being pulled by an invisible thread from somewhere just behind them. I started texting the neighbors to avoid the awkwardness of these lingering grins. I wanted to see if the lag existed in written words, too. My phone buzzed on the concrete slab. Me. "The foundation is drying well today, _Henderson. It really is. It looks wonderful." I waited for his reply, but it didn't come immediately. Then, a second message from him popped up before I could reply to the first. _Henderson. "Did you see that bird?" Then came my reply, me, "What bird?" And finally, his reaction to my question arrived, trailing behind like a comet's tail, _Henderson, the one on the fence. By the third day, the messages started arriving in a chaotic jumble. I would send a thought, and 3 of his replies would flood my screen at once, appearing in the order they were sent, but not the order I was reading them. It felt like his thoughts were traveling through a long, underwater tunnel before reaching me. Me, "Is it getting cold? _Henderson. Yes, _Henderson. I think so too, _Henderson. BRR. I laughed at the screen, but then I looked up and saw Mr. Henderson standing by his porch. He was looking directly at me, his face completely slack, almost mournful. Then, with a sudden jerk of muscle, his mouth pulled into that wide, beaming grin. It stayed there, perfectly fixed, while he watched me. I began to realize the source of the delay. The smiles weren't just facial expressions, they were shadows. I noticed a dimness pooling in the creases of Mr. Henderson's cheeks, a soft, velvety gloom that seemed to sit inside his skin. It wasn't just light hitting his face, it was as if a tiny pocket of twilight lived in every fold of his expression. When he spoke, the dimness was still tucked away, but when he smiled, the dimness expanded, spilling out from his eyes and mouth like ink in water. I texted him again that night, my thumb trembling over the glass. Me, your smile looks heavy, and _ Henderson. It feels quite light today. But when I looked at his reply, I realized he had sent it while his face was still perfectly straight. The grin hadn't arrived yet. It happened a moment later, the dimness in his cheeks pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Then, the messages started to get weirder. They were becoming more frequent, and the lag was growing longer. Me, are you there? _ Henderson. I am, _ Henderson. Still here, _ Henderson. Just waiting. I realized he wasn't just reacting to me. He was processing a backlog of existence. Each smile took time to travel from his mind to his face, and each text had to navigate the same distance. I stood on my foundation and watched him walk toward the fence. He moved with a strange, rhythmic, swaying motion. Me, why do you wait? _ Henderson. The journey is long. He was looking at me now, his face as still as a statue. His eyes were wide, but his mouth was a straight line. I held my breath. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then, the dimness in his cheeks began to swirl. His lips trembled. Finally, it happened. The smile snapped into place, wider than before, stretching until it almost reached his ears. But as it landed, the dimness didn't just sit in the creases, it began to leak out. A small puddle of that velvety gloom spilled onto his chin and dripped toward the ground. I realized then that the smile wasn't a reaction to his mood, it was an entity. It was something living inside him, a tiny inhabitant of the folds of his skin that had to travel from his thoughts to his features. I sent one final text. Me, is it coming out? He didn't reply for nearly a minute. I watched him stand there, his face beginning to sag as the dimness started to overflow. Finally, the phone buzzed. _ Henderson. It wants out. Just as that text appeared, the grin on his face grew so wide it began to crack the corners of his mouth. The dimness stopped pooling in the creases and started to pour forward, spilling over his lips like a slow-moving tide of shadow. It didn't stop at his chin. It began to flow toward my feet, crawling across the concrete foundation like a spill of spilled ink. I watched as the grin remained perfectly fixed, even as the dimness began to swallow the ground around us. The smile stayed wide, bright, and joyful, but the shadow that emerged from it was hungry, creeping toward my toes with every passing second. The Petrichor Path. I have always lived on Willow Creek Lane, a perfectly unremarkable suburban street where the houses stand in orderly rows like soldiers at attention. Every evening at exactly 6:02 p.m., the porch lights of every house flicker simultaneously, a rhythmic pulse of warm amber that feels like the neighborhood is taking a collective breath. It was a comforting ritual, one that grounded my life in predictability. That changed on a Tuesday night when I decided to drive home from the grocery store. The sky was a bruised purple, and the air carried that specific, nostalgic scent of rain hitting hot asphalt, petrichor. It started as a faint hum in the back of my nose, but as I turned onto Willow Creek Lane, the smell didn't dissipate. It intensified. It became heavy, tactile, pressing against my skin like a damp wool blanket draped over my shoulders. The air felt thick enough to chew, saturated with the scent of a summer storm that hadn't actually fallen yet. Then, the GPS flickered to life without me touching the screen. A voice, smooth and melodic, but devoid of human warmth, emanated from the speakers. "Turn right onto the vein," it commanded. I blinked at the dashboard. There was no road named the Vein on any map of my town. Yet, as I steered the car to the right, a narrow strip of pavement materialized out of the darkness, cutting through the familiar backyard of my neighbor's house. It wasn't there before. The asphalt was charcoal black and steaming, though it was barely evening. "Continue straight," the voice whispered. The smell of rain grew sharper, more pungent. It began to taste like copper on the back of my tongue. Every time I hit a bump, the scent would ripple outward in visible waves, rippling through the air like water disturbed by a stone. To my left, the houses of Willow Creek Lane began to stretch. They didn't just grow taller, they elongated, their roofs becoming jagged peaks and their windows widening into oval shapes that looked more like humped backs than glass panes. "The road is hungry," the voice intoned. It wasn't a description. It felt like an observation of fact. I tried to steer back toward my driveway, but the car resisted, pulling me deeper into the vein as if being dragged by an invisible tide. The street began to curve, and on either side, the scenery shifted from suburban normalcy to something surreal. Instead of trees, there were towering pillars of porous rock that oozed a sticky, translucent sap. Instead of grass, the ground was covered in soft, velvet-like moss that changed color from deep emerald to bruised plum as my tires rolled over it. "Are you lost?" I asked aloud, my voice feeling small in the cavernous space. The GPS paused for a heartbeat. "No," it replied. "You are being collected." The smell of rain was now overwhelming, a physical weight that seemed to push against my chest, making it slightly harder to inhale. It felt as though the atmosphere itself were trying to mold me into something else. I noticed then that the road wasn't just long, it was narrowing. The pillars of rock were leaning inward, their tops nearly touching above my head like the ribs of a giant beast. Then came the light, not from the moon or street lamps, but from the asphalt itself. It began to glow with a faint, pulsing luminescence, illuminating the textures of the road. In that light, I saw them, small, crystalline growths protruding from the ground. They looked like clusters of frozen dew, each one humming a different note in a low, vibrating chord. The car began to slow, its engine purring in harmony with the hum of the crystals. "The destination is imminent," the voice announced. It was no longer just a sound. It felt like a thought planted directly into my brain. I reached the end of the vein where it opened into a perfectly circular plaza. There were no houses here, only a single, massive pillar of white marble in the center. As the car stopped, the smell of rain suddenly vanished, replaced by a vacuum-like silence. Out of the shadows at the edge of the plaza, something moved. It wasn't a person, but a ripple in the air, a distortion that looked like a silhouette made of liquid mercury. It drifted toward me, its surface shimmering with every movement. I stepped out of the car, my feet sinking into the velvet moss. The entity didn't have a face in the traditional sense. It was a shifting mass of fluid geometry, constantly folding and unfolding like a piece of origami being manipulated by an invisible hand. It reached out, not with fingers, but with a trailing edge of its liquid body that brushed against my cheek. It felt cool, like a drop of water held perfectly still. "You have arrived," the voice said one last time, no longer coming from the car, but from the entity itself. The mercury shape pulsed once, then settled into a steady glow. I realized then that the road hadn't been a path to a place. It was a bridge between what is known and what is hidden. I looked back at the way I had come, but the vein was gone, replaced by a shimmering haze of mist. I stood in the center of the plaza, the smell of rain still clinging to my hair like a memory, realizing that while I could walk back home now, the road would always remain waiting for its next traveler. As I turned to leave, the entity shifted slightly, and I realized it wasn't just watching me, it was mimicking the shape of my own shadow on the ground. Every evening at exactly 6:02 p.m., the porch lights of every house flicker simultaneously, a rhythmic pulse of warm amber that feels like the neighborhood is taking a collective breath. The gallery of the unlived room. Please, just answer the question. Don't think about what you're going to say next. Just tell me what you saw. I'll start from the beginning. It was a Tuesday, and the museum was nearly empty, save for the hum of the climate control system. My job was simple: walk the halls between midnight and dawn, ensuring no one had snuck in and that the shadows hadn't started to stretch too far. It was a massive space, housing ancient pottery and statues from civilizations that had been dust for millennia. I remember sitting in the center of the West Wing, a room dedicated to domestic life, when I saw it. There was a mirror leaning against the wall, an oversized silver slab framed in heavy, tarnished bronze. It wasn't one of the artifacts. It was something added later by the curators. At first, I thought it was just a standard reflection of the room, the marble floor, the limestone pillars, and the heavy velvet curtains. But as I sat there, my breath hitching in the silence, I realized the reflection didn't match the room I was standing in. The museum was vast and open, but the mirror showed a tiny, cramped bedroom. It had a ceiling of exposed timber beams, a small window with a view of a rainy garden, and a single wooden chair facing a hearth. It felt like a room from a house I had never lived in, yet it felt strangely familiar, as if my subconscious had built it during a dream. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the glass. In the reflection, the bed was covered in a quilt of deep indigo. There were no people in the reflected room, but there was something on the chair. It was small and round, sitting perfectly still. Then the reflection changed. The indigo quilt shifted as if caught in a breeze that wasn't blowing in the museum. And then it moved. A shape began to rise from the bed. It didn't walk, it unfolded. It was a soft, rounded creature, about the size of a large pumpkin, covered in fur that looked like velvet but felt, in my mind's eye, as smooth as silk. It had no eyes at all, just a broad, continuous expanse of skin where a face should be, but its mouth was enormous. When it opened its mouth, I saw the teeth. There were hundreds of them, tiny and needle-sharp, arranged in concentric circles like the petals of a blooming flower. They weren't white, they were the color of bruised plums. The creature looked at me, or rather, it turned its face toward my position in the museum. It wore a permanent, serene smile that stretched from ear to ear, revealing those endless rows of teeth. It didn't make a sound, but I felt its presence press against the glass. Suddenly, the reflection began to bleed into reality. The smell of wood smoke drifted out of the mirror, filling my nostrils. The temperature in the museum dropped 10 degrees. Then, the creature stepped forward in the reflection, its velvet body undulating like jelly. It reached the edge of the mirror and placed a soft, rounded hand, a paw with 3 thick pads, against the glass from the inside. On my side, I felt the surface of the mirror ripple like a pond hit by a stone. A small crack appeared, not in the bronze frame, but in the center of the glass. From that crack, a tiny wisp of wood smoke escaped. The creature leaned its face against the fracture, and its smile widened until the teeth seemed to vibrate. It wasn't just looking at me, it was tasting my space with its many rows of fangs. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then, the creature did something that made my blood turn to ice. It didn't stay in the reflection anymore. A small, velvet-furred limb poked through the crack into the museum air. It was soft and warm. Then another followed. The creature began to pull itself out of the mirror, its body squeezing through the narrow slit like honey pouring from a jar. As it emerged, it wasn't just moving into my world, it was pulling the reflected room with it. The marble floor of the museum began to shrink, replaced by the timber beams and the indigo quilt. I felt myself being pulled toward the mirror, my boots sliding on the narrowing ground. The creature fully emerged now, sitting on the museum floor, its massive mouth hanging open in that eternal, pleasant smile. It reached out with those 3 padded paws and gripped my shoulders. Its skin felt like warm moss. It didn't have eyes to see me, but it seemed to know exactly where I was. It opened its mouth wide, and the hundreds of plum-colored teeth glinted in the dim museum light. It leaned in, its face inches from mine, and let out a soft, contented sigh that sounded like air escaping a flute. Then, with one swift motion, it closed its mouth over my head, not biting me, but simply enveloping my face in its velvet warmth. The mirror behind us shivered and then went perfectly flat and still once more. When I finally pulled away, the creature was gone, and the room had returned to its original state of limestone and marble. I stood there, gasping, my hair slightly damp from the moisture of its breath. I looked back at the mirror, expecting to see the creature inside or perhaps a different room entirely. Instead, the reflection showed the museum exactly as it was, empty and silent. But when I looked down at the floor where the creature had sat, there were 3 perfect, wet paw prints pressed into the dust. And in the center of the mirror, right where the crack had been, a new small mark appeared, a tiny, perfect smudge of plum-colored saliva that hadn't yet dried. The extra step. The clock on the wall of the dispatch room doesn't tick, it groans. It is 3 a.m. at the St. Jude's Overnight Depot, a place where the air smells of diesel fumes and old upholstery. My job is simple: sit in the high-backed chair, watch the monitors, and ensure the buses depart on schedule. Most nights are rhythmic and predictable, but tonight, the silence feels heavy, like a blanket made of wet wool. On the wall directly opposite my desk sits a single piece of parchment, a child's drawing left behind by a passenger who never stayed long enough to name themselves. It depicts a family standing in a row, a tall father, a short mother, and a small girl with a crown of daisies. Every morning when I arrive, the drawing is different. Each night, the entity adds one new member to the line. On Monday, the drawing had 4 figures. On Tuesday, 5. By Wednesday, there were 6. The figures aren't detailed. They are simple charcoal strokes, but as they multiply, the spacing between them grows slightly more cramped. I began to notice a pattern in the way they appeared. They weren't just appearing at random. They were being drawn by an invisible hand that seemed to be moving through the room while I slept. By Friday, there were 10 figures. They looked like a crowd now, huddled together under a vast, empty sky. Then came the sound. It started on Saturday night around midnight. I was leaning back, my eyes burning from the fluorescent hum of the overhead lights, when I heard it, a footfall. A single thump from the balcony above the dispatch room. I looked up, but there was nothing but shadows and dust motes. Then came another thump, followed by mine as I shifted in my chair. But then, a third sound arrived, a soft, wet click-clack. It wasn't just an echo, it was a sequence. Whenever I took one step toward the window, something else took 2. Whenever I moved my head to the left, something else moved its head further to the left, as if trying to catch up to my rhythm. I stood up to investigate the balcony. My boots hit the floor. Thump. Immediately, a second thump followed, then a third, much faster than mine. It was a triplet of sounds, my pace, its mimicry, and its punctuation. I couldn't see it clearly in the dim light, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It felt like a physical weight in the air, a pressure against my skin. I walked toward the drawing on the wall to see if it had changed during the hour of my waking. It had. There were now 12 figures. The new one at the end of the line was different from the others. While the father and mother were sturdy charcoal blocks, this new member was a thin, vibrating squiggle that seemed to shimmer. "Who are you?" I whispered to the empty room. The response wasn't a voice, but a sound from the corner of the ceiling. Click-clack, it had moved from the balcony to the rafters. I realized then that every time it added a member to the drawing, it was claiming a piece of the room's space. The more figures there were, the closer it moved to my chair. I decided to test it. I began to walk in a circle around the desk. 1 step for me, 2 for it. 2 steps for me, 4 for it. 4 steps for me, 8 for it. The math was perfect, but the physical manifestation of the sound was becoming more complex. It wasn't just mimicking my distance anymore, it was mimicking my weight. When I walked slowly, its footsteps were heavy and muddy. When I hurried, its footsteps became sharp and metallic, like silver coins falling on marble. By 4 a.m., the air felt thick enough to swallow. The drawing now had 20 figures. They were so crowded that they were starting to overlap, their charcoal limbs intertwining like a tangled thicket of briars. I noticed that the new members weren't just being added to the end. They were appearing in the gaps between the original 4. I sat back down, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was expectant. Then, from directly behind my head, I heard a sound that made my breath hitch. It wasn't a footfall this time. It was the sound of something sliding along, smooth friction like silk being pulled over stone. I didn't turn around. If I turned around, it would be official. I looked at the drawing one last time. There were now 24 figures. And for the first time, there was a final figure standing right in the center, facing everyone else. It wasn't a squiggle or a block. It was a perfect, detailed silhouette of a person with no face, only a wide, open mouth. Suddenly, I felt a cold draft on my neck. The footsteps stopped entirely. No mimicry, no extra counts, just a profound, heavy stillness. Then, The sound came from directly in front of my nose, the sound of a single breath being exhaled. Finally, the room seemed to hum. I closed my eyes and felt something press against my shoulder, not a hand, but a weight that felt like wet fur and cold porcelain. I realized then that it hadn't been mimicking me from a distance all night. It had been closing the gap, one extra step at a time, until there was no space left between us. I opened my eyes to see the drawing had changed once more. There were 25 figures now. The faceless one was gone, replaced by a silhouette that looked exactly like me, but with its mouth slightly wider than mine. I am still sitting in the chair, but I no longer feel the weight of my own body. I feel the weight of two bodies occupying the same space, and I can hear it waiting for me to blink so it can take my turn. The Stutter in the Hallway, October 12th. I have been granted the use of Blackwood Manor for the duration of the evacuation. It is a sprawling, requisitioned country estate with high ceilings and heavy velvet curtains that seem to swallow the light. Tonight, the silence is thick enough to taste. I sat in the library, watching the fire die down to embers, when I heard it, a distinct, wet thud from the gallery. It sounded like a heavy sponge hitting a stone floor. When I looked up, the heavy oak door at the far end of the hall was wide open. I remember locking it before dinner. By morning, there were 3 perfect prints of moisture on the rug, each one the size of a human palm, but shaped like a teardrop with a jagged edge. October 14th. The footprints have returned. Every morning when I wake, the gallery door is slightly ajar and a new trail of wet mark stretches from the threshold to the center of the room. They are not perfectly uniform. Some are deep enough to hold the shape of a ridge, others are shallow as if something light brushed over them. The most unsettling part is that there is no puddle, no spilled vase, and no rain outside. Just these damp, weeping marks appearing in a dry room. I spent an hour today tracing them with my hand, feeling the lingering chill in the wood. October 16th. Something shifted today. The trail didn't just stop at the center of the room anymore. A new set of tracks emerged from the ceiling. They were dripping down like melting wax, forming a pool of moisture directly beneath the chandelier. I stood in the center of the hall and whispered, "Who is walking on your roof?" There was no echo, only the sound of a single drop hitting my shoulder. The gallery door remains locked when I sleep, yet it always finds its way open by dawn. October 18th. The prints are changing shape. They are becoming more deliberate. Instead of teardrops, they now resemble the heel of a boot, but with 3 distinct protrusions on the side, like a clawed hoof. Yesterday, I found a trail that didn't just move forward, it moved in a circle around my chair while I was reading. It felt as though something were orbiting me. When I finally gathered the courage to look toward the gallery door, I saw a blur of motion, not a solid thing, but a shivering pulse of movement, like a film reel caught between 2 frames. October 20th. I can see it now, and it is far stranger than I imagined. It is not a ghost or a solid beast. It is a creature made of between. When it moves, it looks like a smear of ink on a page, a stutter in reality. It has no constant shape. It exists as the flicker between a crouch and a leap. It looks like a mass of iridescent scales that are half folded, half unfurled. Its body is a vibrating hum of motion, resembling a shutter clicking rapidly over a moving painting. When it passes by, the air smells of ozone and wet wool. October 21st. I stayed awake tonight with a candle in my hand. The gallery door was locked tight. At midnight, the first wet print appeared. Then another. They didn't just appear. They bloomed like flowers opening in slow motion. I watched a print form 3 feet away, then another 5 feet further. The creature was moving, but it wasn't walking in the traditional sense. It was flickering from point A to point B, leaving its wet residue behind as if it were shedding its very existence into the floorboards. October 22nd. I heard a sound, a wet, rhythmic slapping, like a heartbeat muffled by water. The creature emerged from the gallery. It didn't have a face in the way we do. Instead, it had a surface of shifting ripples that caught the candlelight. It moved with a strange, jerky grace, vibrating so fast that its edges seemed to blur into the shadows. One moment it was a tall, thin needle of motion. The next, it was a wide, flat disc of shimmering scales. It didn't walk toward me. It stuttered toward me, skipping over the space between seconds. October 23rd. It is closer now. The footprints are everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, even on my own bedside table. Every time it flickers, a new wet mark appears, as if the creature is weeping its physical form onto the world. It seems to be hungry for space. During the day, I saw it hover near the mantel. It looked like a smear of violet light and silver scales, vibrating with such intensity that the dust on the shelf danced in a frantic circle around it. October 24th. The creature has stopped flickering between points. It is now flickering while staying in place. It stands in the center of the hall, a masterpiece of almost. It is almost a sphere, almost a lizard, almost a cloud of rain. Its scales are wet to the touch, but when I reach out to grab one, my hand passes through it as if it were a memory. It exists in the split second between a breath taken and a breath exhaled. October 25th. Tonight, the gallery door remained shut until I woke up at 3 a.m. The creature was no longer in the hall. There was only one wet footprint on my pillow. I sat up, heart hammering against my ribs, and looked toward the gallery door. It was still locked, yet the handle turned with a soft, wet click. From behind the wood, a voice, or rather, a vibration of a voice, drifted out. "I am here," it pulsed. Then, the creature flickered into view right beside my head, its scales shimmering like oil on water. It didn't have eyes to look at me, yet I felt its gaze pressing against my skin. The last thing I saw before the candle went out was a wet print forming on my own chest where its body had touched mine. It is no longer just on the floor, it has moved inside me. The lagging shadow of the frozen basin. I am speaking to you because I have to let someone know, even if your face remains a blur on the other side of this glass. You are listening now, and soon, you will understand why I never walk alone anymore. It began 3 months ago on that vast, silver expanse, the Great Basin Lake during that strange week in late March when the frost refuses to melt, but the water beneath is screaming. The ice was thin, a translucent skin stretched over deep blue silence, groaning with every shift of the temperature. I went there to clear my head, seeking the solitude of the winter's end. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, smelling of wet stone and old snow. I thought I was alone until I saw him. He was standing at the far edge of the shoreline, a man in a heavy wool coat of an indeterminate color, somewhere between charcoal and slate. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, anchored to the earth like a statue carved from stone. There was no wind to ruffle his hair or bend his shoulders. He was perfectly still, a silhouette against the pale gray horizon. I took a step forward into the crunching frost, the sound of my boot shattering, the icy crust echoing across the basin. He moved exactly 1 beat later. It wasn't a smooth motion. It was a deliberate, rhythmic mimicry. When I shifted my weight, his body followed with a slight delay, as if his muscles were processing my intentions before they could act. It felt as though he were watching me in a state of perpetual observation, absorbing the data of my existence before translating it into his own physical form. I stopped, and he took one more step toward me before halting. I realized then that he was maintaining a precise distance. 40 steps. Not a hair closer, not an inch further. It was a mathematical sanctuary between us. I started to walk again, a steady pace across the groaning ice, and he followed, his gait mirroring my own with that haunting, infinitesimal delay. He wasn't just walking, he was learning me. Every time I swung my arm wide, he mirrored the arc of fraction of a second later. When I stumbled over a ridge of frozen snow, he performed the exact same stumble a heartbeat after I did. It felt like watching a recording play back in real time, but with a slight lag in the playback. The more I moved, the more his movements became fluid, losing their mechanical stiffness and adopting my own unique rhythm. He began to lean into my curves and sharpen my angles. If I paused to catch my breath, he lingered in the air for a moment before settling into a stance, like a ghost trying to decide where to land. I tried to test him, desperate to see if he was merely a machine or something more sentient. I spun in a quick circle. He did the same, his heavy coat billowing in the same direction as mine. I hopped twice. He landed with the same soft thud on the ice. But what unsettled me most was his face. He didn't have the usual human expression of wonder or fatigue. His features were neutral, almost expectant, as if he were a sculptor waiting to see how much clay you would mold him into. There was no malice in his eyes, only an intense, quiet focus. As we moved toward the center of the lake, the groaning of the ice grew louder, a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated in my chest. The man remained exactly 40 steps away. He was a ghost of my own motion, a physical echo trailing behind me in the white expanse. I tried to run, hoping to break his pattern, hoping that by increasing my velocity, he might lose his grip on my identity. But he simply increased his speed to match mine, maintaining that perfect, agonizing gap. It felt as though we were two notes in a harmony, tied together by an invisible thread of causality. The closer we got to the center, the more his mimicry became eerily precise. He began to capture the small things, the slight tilt of my chin when I looked at the horizon, the way my shoulders bunched before a stride, even the tiny twitch of my fingers against the cold. By the time we reached the deepest point of the basin, he wasn't just copying me, he was anticipating the very soul of my movement. I felt as though I were walking with my own past self, or perhaps a version of myself that lived just behind my shoulder. There was a strange intimacy to it, a feeling of being double exposed on a piece of film. I stopped completely to listen to the wind. He took one final step forward, closing the distance by a fraction of an inch before freezing. The ice cracked beneath us with a sound like a gunshot. In that silence, I realized he wasn't just following me, he was perfecting me. He had gathered every nuance of my existence into his own frame. Finally, I turned to face him fully, bracing for the moment we would meet eye to eye. I took one final, deliberate step toward him, breaking the 40-step rule for the first time in hours. The tension reached a snapping point. He reacted instantly, lunging forward to fill the gap. As our faces nearly touched, he didn't just mimic my expression, he mirrored the exact shape of my mouth as it fell open in awe. The lake went still, the groaning ceasing as if the water itself were holding its breath. Then he did something that made my heart seize. He took a deep breath, not his own, but a perfect replica of the air I had just exhaled. And then, without a sound, he reached out and touched my chest with a hand that felt like warm parchment. It wasn't an imitation of a touch, it was the culmination of every movement we had shared. He finally closed his eyes in the exact same way mine did, and for 1 second, I saw my own face reflected in his, perfect and slightly delayed. The realization hit me with a physical weight. He didn't just follow my walk because he was moving. He followed it because he was waiting for me to finish so he could become what I am. He is still there now, even when the lake is empty, standing in the corner of my room and waiting for me to move so he can do the same. The script of the Seance. The snow didn't fall so much as it besieged us, a white weight pressing against the timber walls of the cabin until the world outside became a void. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and wet wool. I sat across from Elena in the center of the living room, our chairs pulled close enough that our knees almost touched. We weren't just waiting for the storm to break, we were waiting for the gap in the night to open. It was a phenomenon my grandmother described as a puncture in time, a moment where no stars will ever grow because the light of the universe had simply forgotten to fill that specific pocket of reality. To summon what lived inside that gap, Elena took her role as the medium with a solemnity that bordered on ritual. She sat perfectly still, her spine straight against the wooden chair, holding a heavy fountain pen in her right hand and a sheet of parchment across her lap. We didn't need mirrors or flickering candles to see it. We needed her voice to anchor us. "Speak the first word," she whispered. I took a breath, my own heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped moth. Silence. Elena's eyes glazed over, her pupils expanding until they swallowed the iris. She didn't just repeat the word, she echoed it as if catching a falling stone in a pond. "Silence," she said. She then dipped her pen into the ink and wrote the word on the parchment. Her handwriting was elegant, a flowing cursive that mimicked my own style perfectly. But as the seconds ticked by, the stillness of the cabin began to warp. The snow outside seemed to freeze in place, suspended in midair like white dust on a velvet cloth. "The weight," I said. "The weight," she repeated. She wrote it down. But as my eyes tracked her hand, I noticed something peculiar. The letters weren't just copying mine, they were beginning to behave strangely. While my weight leaned slightly to the right for emphasis, her written word began to tilt toward the left, a subtle, unnatural slant that felt wrong to the eye. "A shadow," I whispered. "A shadow," she echoed. She wrote it. The slant of the letters increased. It wasn't just a tilt anymore. The tops of the letters were beginning to stretch toward the ceiling, while the bottoms stayed anchored to the line. We moved into the second movement of the seance. I began to describe the sensation of the gap, that feeling of being suspended in a vacuum where time holds its breath. "The void is hungry," I said. "The void is hungry," she repeated. She wrote it rapidly now, her hand moving with a frantic fluidity. The letters were no longer just leaning, they were beginning to curve inward, as if the ink itself wanted to huddle together for warmth. Each stroke became thicker, more deliberate. I noticed that while my spoken words remained steady, her voice was gaining a slight metallic resonance, like a bell ringing underwater. As we progressed, the cabin grew colder. The fire in the hearth didn't shrink, it simply turned a pale, ghostly blue and stopped crackling. The only sound was the scratching of her pen against the parchment and our rhythmic exchange. "It reaches," I said. "It reaches," she repeated. She wrote it. Now, the letters were leaning so far to the left that they almost lay flat, pointing toward the corner of the room where the shadows seemed deepest. It was as if the handwriting had developed a sense of direction, fleeing from something unseen in the center of the room. Then came the shift. The scratching stopped for a full minute. Elena didn't blink. She sat with her pen poised over the paper, but she wasn't looking at it anymore. She was looking at me, and her mouth was slightly open. "Why do you lean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why do you lean?" she repeated. She wrote the question, but as she did, the ink began to bleed outward in perfectly symmetrical circles. The letters didn't just tilt anymore. They started to vibrate on the page. They were swaying back and forth, a tiny, rhythmic motion that made the parchment hum against her thighs. I felt a presence enter the room, not a ghost in the traditional sense, but a pressure. It was the feeling of a heavy curtain being pulled across a vast, empty stage. The gap in the night had finally spilled into the cabin. "The ink is mine," I said, my voice barely a thread of sound. "The ink is mine," she repeated. She wrote it, and this time, her hand moved with such force that the pen nearly flew from her grip. The letters didn't just lean, they collapsed toward each other, merging into a single, dense cluster of ink in the center of the page. Then, she began to write without my prompting. Her hand flew across the parchment, producing words I hadn't spoken, yet she still repeated them perfectly as they emerged from her lips. It was no longer a dialogue, it was a transcription of something else speaking through us both. "The gap is full," she whispered. "The gap is full," she repeated. She wrote it. The letters were now leaning so sharply to the left that they were almost upside down, and they were beginning to grow tiny, hair-like serrations along their edges. They looked less like writing and more like a row of microscopic teeth biting into the paper. I reached out to touch her hand, but before my fingers could meet hers, she spoke one final time without looking up from the page. "You are the ink," she said. "You are the ink," she repeated. She wrote it. The letters didn't just lean, they straightened out perfectly, standing tall and proud like soldiers, but as I watched them, they began to move independently of her hand. They started to crawl toward the edge of the paper, migrating toward my reaching fingers like a colony of tiny, black ants. I pulled my hand back as the ink touched my skin. It wasn't wet, it was dry and slightly textured. As I watched, the letters on the page began to tilt again, but this time they were leaning toward me, hungry for more space. Elena finally exhaled, her eyes snapping shut. The blue fire died instantly, and the silence that followed was heavier than the snow. "It is finished," I said. "It is finished," she repeated. She wrote it. But as the final period landed on the page, the letters didn't stay still. They began to tilt toward my chest, leaning inward with an aggressive, predatory slant that suggested they were about to jump off the paper and into my very skin. The Thief of Seconds. I've spent 3 years as the night shift receptionist at St. Jude's Memorial, a job that most people consider a tomb for the living. It is a quiet existence. I sit behind a heavy mahogany desk, nursing lukewarm coffee and watching the fluorescent lights hum against the sterile white tiles. The silence of 3 a.m. has a weight to it, a physical pressure that seems to push the air into your lungs. But lately, the silence hasn't been empty. It has been occupied by the portrait. It hangs directly opposite my chair, a large oil painting of a nobleman whose name is etched in gold leaf at the bottom, the Constant. He isn't a man of many features. He is a study in texture. His velvet coat looks heavy enough to hold water, and his face is a map of deep, rhythmic wrinkles. For the first month, I didn't notice anything strange. Then I noticed his age. Every morning when I arrived, he looked slightly older than he had the night before. By Tuesday, he had a new furrow in his brow. By Friday, a silver strand of hair had migrated from his temple to his crown. He wasn't just aging, he was stealing my time. The realization hit me during my second month. Every year I lived, every hour I spent blinking and breathing at this desk, the portrait consumed a piece of itself to pay for it. It was as if my own vitality was leaking out into the canvas, fueling his slow transition from youth to antiquity. I started to feel the physical toll by my 6th month. My joints began to ache with a dull, rhythmic thrum, and I found myself yawning even when my eyes were wide open. The portrait, meanwhile, was becoming magnificent. His skin had turned into a fine network of parchment-like creases. His hair was now a thicket of snowy frost. He wasn't just aging linearly anymore. He was accelerating. One night, around 2 a.m., the humming of the lights cut out completely. In the absolute vacuum of sound, I heard it, a soft, wet friction, like leather rubbing against silk. I looked up and saw the portrait's chest rise. It wasn't a hallucination. The velvet of his coat swelled outward as if he were inhaling the very oxygen in the room. He didn't just look older, he felt heavier. His skin had taken on a waxy, bruised hue, like a plum left too long in the sun. I reached out my hand to touch the frame, and, for a second, I thought I felt a pulse beneath the paint. Then came the night of the great shift. It was a Tuesday, heavy with humidity, and the air smelled of floor wax and old paper. The portrait had reached a state of extreme antiquity. His face was a landscape of deep valleys. His lips were thin lines of dried clay. But as I sat there, my own hands felt strangely light, almost translucent. I noticed that while my skin remained smooth, the portrait's eyes, which were the color of tarnished copper, seemed to be tracking my movement. He wasn't just a passive observer anymore. He was an active predator of duration. Every time I blinked, his wrinkles deepened by a millimeter. Every time I took a breath, his velvet coat grew another fold of shadow. The more I lived, the more he thrived on the expenditure of my seconds. At 4:15 a.m., the atmosphere shifted from eerie to suffocating. The portrait began to lean forward. It didn't move in a smooth motion. It jerked, like a clock hand skipping a beat. His head tilted slightly to the right, and his mouth opened, not a wide yawn, but a tiny, deliberate parting of lips. A sound escaped him, not a voice, but a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 sunsets. It was the sound of a man who had spent centuries watching others grow old while he sat perfectly still. I felt a sudden, sharp tug in my chest, as if an invisible hook had snagged my ribs and pulled. My vision blurred for a moment. I looked at my hands and gasped. The skin on my knuckles was beginning to crinkle. The faint lines of my youth were being sucked into the frame. It was happening in real time. The portrait was no longer just stealing my hours. He was cannibalizing my very essence to maintain his regal posture. He wanted to be old, but he didn't want to do the work of living. He wanted me to do the living for him. I stood up, my chair screeching against the floor, and walked toward the wall. The closer I got, the more intense the sensation became. It felt like standing before a vacuum cleaner that inhaled the color from a room. My hair began to turn white at the tips, starting from my forehead and racing backward. My skin tightened over my cheekbones. I could feel my muscles losing their spring, becoming the firm, sturdy things of an elder. And there, in the frame, the portrait was reaching his peak. His face was a masterpiece of survival, every wrinkle a trophy of a second he had stolen from my life. I reached out and pressed my palm against the bottom of the frame. The wood was warm, unnaturally warm, like a stone left in the sun. For a moment, our skin met, my smooth, aging palm against his wrinkled, ancient face. I felt a sudden surge of vertigo, a sensation of falling backward into a deep well. It was as if he were trying to pull me into the oil and pigment, to fold me into the velvet coat where I could join him in his permanent state of becoming. I pulled my hand back with a gasp. The transition was nearly complete. My knees felt weak, and a faint ache settled into my lower back, the hallmark of a person who had lived through decades of winter. I looked at the portrait one last time. He was no longer just an old man in a painting. He was a portrait of my life, rendered in strokes of ochre and umber. His wrinkles were now almost identical to the ones forming on my own forehead. I realized then that there would be no end until I was gone. There was no way to stop the theft. He didn't want to share. He wanted to collect. He was a hoarder of moments, and I was his primary source of currency. The hospital corridors were silent again, save for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, a sound that felt like a countdown. As the sun began to peek through the high windows, casting long, dusty beams across the floor, I sat back down in my chair. I am older now. My hair is longer, my skin is thinner, and my heart beats with a slightly slower rhythm than it did yesterday. The portrait sits opposite me, looking content. He has taken what he needed to keep his masterpiece vivid for another night. I watched him as the first ray of light hit his face, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the very center of his chest, where there had been only velvet before, there was now a tiny, perfect likeness of my own eye, closed in sleep, yet forever watching me. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.